Now, Dr. Swanson is President Emeritus of Sunpower Corporation, and he was first at Stanford University faculty and then started the company of Sunpower. I guess his interaction with Eli's date in 1980s when
1980s.
80s.
80.
Yeah, 1980s, right?
No, 1980.
80. Oh, okay. Include the 80s.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. They actually have been working together on the solar devices, especially 4N squares. Without much of introduction, I will let him speak.
Well,
Please.
thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here celebrating Eli's 65th birthday. I can give him some pointers on how to sign up for Social Security if you need it. It's very complicated. Anyway, I've known Eli since 1980. I knew it had been a long time, and I knew he'd remember, and he did when he came to Stanford. And we've had a interaction since then, and a sort of a weak coupling limit interaction, if you will, that's gone on since then, and it's been a great pleasure in every regard. So I presume there's a way to advance here. Not like that. Not like that. Right here. So the future of photovoltaics. I got the feeling that this title I was supposed to answer what the future of photovoltaics was. And the answer I came up with was really high efficiency solar cells. Unfortunately, when I looked at the program, that was the topic of the next talk, not my talk, which talk was delayed, as I understand, by the fog this morning. But so I'm going to have to defer, although I think you'll see through my presentation that there's a theme of the importance of efficiency and that goes through it. This is my safe harbor statement. I have witnesses that I showed it. But before we go to the future, let's go a little bit to where we've come from, because that kind of helps understand where we are and where we could go. This is a history of the best silicon laboratory cells throughout the development of the cell, and you'll notice that it kind of stopped in about 1995. There really hasn't been much progress in the overall performance of the cell, but it does beg the question of how high can we go, because we do obviously want as high efficiency as we can get. People started trying to ask this question very early on. How high a performance can a silicon solar cell be? The first attempt was at Bell Labs by Mort Prince, who used silicon device modeling, basically drift and diffusion equations, to attempt to calculate the operation, how a solar cell worked, and thereby posit some limit as to how high efficiency could be. And he came out with about 23% corrected to the way we calculate efficiencies today, the spectra that we use. Shortly thereafter, Shockley and Queisser came up with a more thermodynamic approach, and they said it was about 33%, corrected again. There's obviously a completely different approach to the problem in these two calculations. In the thermodynamic limit case, none of the material parameters that appear in the device limit appear. There's no mobility, there's no minority carrier lifetime, there's no device thickness, there's no doping density. The only parameter that goes in there is the band gap. And somehow they managed to get an efficiency that was quite a bit higher than the efficiency posited by the device models. So you could sort of say that the history of these two approaches over time was to try and reconcile that difference. Because ultimately, if the device model is right, thermodynamically correct, it should agree with the thermodynamic calculation. And in fact, they do today. I'd like to sort of step briefly through the history there because Eli played a significant role in resolving the difference between the thermodynamic and the silicon device performance mechanisms. This shows the device model calculations as they evolved over time. And you can see that the device modelers were motivated to increase the so-called device limit conversion efficiency, not the least of which was that the empirical results were catching up very quickly and, in fact, could pass them in the near future, so that it was clear that device modeling was primitive at best. There was a big jump in 1980s by Lefersky, who was the first to include the idea that light trapping could be important. Now, he used the sort of early version of Getzberger that Dr. Fan mentioned. But anyway, he put it into the device model. And he also posited what really has become the modern paradigm for how a solar cell works. He put in minority carrier mirrors, or band offsets, to the conduction and valence band. Band offsets at the electron contact that would repel holes, and band offsets at the hole contact, which would repel electrons, allowing an intimate coupling of the external circuit to the quasi-Fermi levels of electrons and holes. And more simply putting, that set the mechanism for, in principle, having zero surface recombination velocity. And he got a bit of a bump up, but not a dramatic bump up by doing that. It was then that Eli stepped into the picture with redefining how light trapping should be computed more accurately, as well as realizing that the absorption tail, the weak absorption limit, even below the band gap of silicon, where you can have absorption with phonon absorption, and, to add an extra bit of energy, in that weak tail, once you do light trapping, becomes a very significant contributor to the photogeneration current. And did an exhaustive calculation which knocked that conversion efficiency up to 30%. Now, one thing that he included was Auger recombination, and unfortunately for him, it was unknown that Auger calculation was wrong for the density limits that were involved right there. That was kind of corrected later on by Campbell and Cuevas, who showed that in the weak carrier density limit, there's a coupling. The electrons in holes will essentially form an exciton, which causes the recombination rate to go up, and came up with a new Auger limit, which dropped that down. But also it became clear that there was an important thing in the device model that had been overlooked, and that's photon recycling. The device model has a thickness of the device in it, and somehow the thermodynamic model, of course, doesn't, so somehow that thickness limit has to be got out of there to make the two equivalent. And it was by realizing that as you make the device thicker, that you have more chance for photon recycling within the bulk of the device that balances out the excess recombination in the bulk of the device, where that was allowed, that came together. And so it turns out that if you include photon recycling in the device, an interesting thing happens. The red line shows the history of the thermodynamic limit, about which not much had happened, really. But if you take the modern device model, take out Auger recombination, which is not encompassed by thermodynamic, the simple thermodynamic model, the device model predicts the same result as the thermodynamic model. That's what that little arrow shows. So the limit efficiency, which is now well established for silicon at 29%, the purple square, if you take Auger recombination out, it goes up to the thermodynamic limit, as you would expect it to. So all these have finally kind of come together, I think, in a very elegant form. And Eli played a critical role in helping create that synthesis. We at Sunpower, this is the only Sunpower slide I think I have, certainly believe in efficiency, and we work hard to keep the efficiency going up. And one of the additions I forgot to mention to helping make the solar cell practical, you see the Lefersky's idea of putting minority carrier mirrors in. Today we call those heterojunction contacts, and Eli and I worked together in the mid-'80s on really very early heterojunction contacts to silicon that we called SIPOs, and actually published a paper with very high voltages out of a cell. Unfortunately, that line got not pursued too strongly, and it was up to Sanyo to kind of finish the work in that area with their hit cell, which is, I think, the concept of having heterojunction contacts to silicon is probably the ultimate direction that silicon will end up going over time. Of course, it's easier to do that in the gallium arsenide system, so that may make silicon's efforts moot. But in any case, we thought about, when is my talk supposed to be over?
You have enough time. You started at maybe 6, 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. We always knew that efficiency was important, and but you know, we would give talks about it, and we would talk to investors about it, and the way we computed it was the way everyone else computed it, and that was, well, efficiency is important because you have to pay for what's called the area-related balance of system. You have to pay for the steel to hold the panels up, the wiring, the concrete, the installation, the site preparation. All those things besides the module cost are now called balance of system costs, and most of those scale with area. So we smugly had all these formulas about the value of efficiency, and if you can compute that number. It's very simple. You can see that the module of efficiency 2 compared to a module of efficiency 1 should have an increased value based on that simple calculation that you do. So if you put numbers into that, typical balance of system costs of maybe $50 a square meter for the area related, and module efficiency, say module 1 efficiency is a standard module at 14%, and module 2 is a high performance Sunpower module at 19%. You can come up with what you would impute the value of that efficiency gain to be, and you plug it into that equation and you get 12 cents a watt, okay? Which is nice, but it turns out it's completely wrong. And people that do this and go out there and explain to bankers and stuff this when they're trying to get money for their companies, it's clear now that they've never actually sold a PV module before. This shows, for example, this is a little bit old data, and these prices have come down dramatically since then. But this shows what the module spot prices are in Germany through the period. And that you can see they're up through mid-2010. The top blue line is a Sunpower 19% module, and the darker blue line below that is the average for European modules, and the average for Chinese standard efficiency modules is down at the bottom. And you can see that this difference is not anywhere close to 12 cents a watt. In fact, it's at least 40 euros per watt, and in many cases more like $1 per watt premium for having the high efficiency. So that brings up the question, well, clearly efficiency is really important, but why? Why is it that important, okay, to the customer? Why are they willing to pay that much more for a high efficiency product? And it turns out what we missed in the whole calculation is the impact of area constraints. Okay? PV systems tend to be constrained in a certain amount of area. You have a certain amount of roof space on your roof, for example, to put a PV system, right? And you think, some people said, well, obviously that's an area constrained situation, but you can put PV panels in the desert. There's a lot of desert. That's not an area constrained situation. Well, that's not true. Because the way the industry works is a developer decides to build a PV plant. He goes out and secures a plot of land. That plot of land is usually a sectioned, owned by farmers that sold it to him or something. It's bounded by roads, rivers, you name it. He's got a piece of land to develop into a PV plant. And then he goes to PV companies and says, tell me what you can do. Well, you can't go to him and say, I'm going to put a low performance system in there. All you have to do is buy all the neighboring farms and to get enough power, okay? So it is an area constraint. And I think that difference is very subtle. It's hard for people to understand why that gives such high value. But what it does do is it reaches back into cost elements in the overall value chain that are sort of fixed, independent of area, okay? These cost elements are things like site mobilization cost, permitting cost, cost of making the sale, cost of sending the salesman there, things that don't normally occur in the so-called COGS, cost of goods sold part of the balance, part of the income statement, but are below, so-called below the line things like sales costs. It turns out that if you do the math, any cost that scales sublinearly with area forces extra value on the system. And it can even go beyond that. I was surprised, for example, one time I was meeting with dealers in Germany, and they are getting a especially high premium for our modules, and I couldn't quite figure it out. And they said, oh, it's very simple. People have a roof. They want to put PV on the roof. And PV, because of the nature of the feed-in tariff in Germany, had a return of something like 15% annual rate of return. Okay, CD is like 2%, right? So for an individual homeowner, this is the most high return investment that they could possibly make with their money, right? There's no other option that's risk-free that would return 15 or 18%. So, but they only have one roof, right? So, and if they have enough money, they want to put as much power on that roof as they possibly can. They can't go to their neighbor and say, can I borrow your roof because I got more money to spend on PV and I want 15%. No, he's going to say, I'll take my roof and get 15%, thanks. So that means that they will actually accept a lower rate of return in order to get more dollar return on their investment because there's nothing else that can come close. So my only point here is that efficiency has a subtle impact throughout the entire photovoltaic value chain that is not obvious at first blush. Let me go, and there are a lot of other things we missed too. So anyway, as a result of a lot of hard work, I think it's very safe to say PV has arrived. And we are right now in our industry in a bit of a tsunami or something where a perfect storm, if you will, where there's a lot of turmoil and foment. But if you step back, you can see that what we've done in this industry is pretty amazing. Last year, we put in about 22 gigawatts worth of PV capacity worldwide. Module prices are coming down. Last year, they were $1.25. This year, per watt, this year they'll be under $1 per watt. So it's really a huge success story. This is showing the costs coming down very fast, but you probably know that. But I think one of the things that people don't really realize is that basically the costs are there. This shows the cost of various ways to generate electricity today, and it compares some of the renewable options at the top and the gas and the conventional fossil fuel fired and nuclear options at the bottom. And you can see, for example, that solar PV going from $73 a megawatt hour, so that's 7 cents per kilowatt hour, at the low end for a big ground-mounted system, to about 19 cents a kilowatt hour for a large rooftop system, is in the same range as the other conventional options. It's similar to a gas peaking plant. It's similar to a nuclear power plant. It's similar to a coal power plant. It's less than a gas peaking power plant, and which is what solar provides. Solar does generally displace peaking loads because it coincides with air conditioning peak demand. So we've basically got there, if you will, in terms of costs. And there's a lot of evidence of that. This shows, for example, the last data that I have is in 2009, but it's gotten more so. This shows the new capacity installed in Europe in 2009. You can see most of the new capacity was wind at 10 gigawatts. This is within the European Union. The next was natural gas at about 6 gigawatts. And the third was PV at about 4 gigawatts. Now that PV has gone up and become much larger in the last few years in Europe, way over 10 gigawatts. So everything else is what to the right of that. Coal actually had a net negative. There were more coal plant retirements than new coal plants built, and nothing else contributed substantially. The world is shifting into a situation where wind, PV, and natural gas are the new generation options available. So I think the community has really done an incredible job, and it's great to be able to talk to you about it, and having known Eli for so many years, and knowing the role that he played in creating this. We have, here's another example of how PV has become cost effective. This is the so-called, the black line is the German feed-in tariff. If you feed PV into the grid in Germany, you get paid directly for the power you generate, for the energy you generate. And that tariff has been coming down over time as the pricing of modules has come down. So the German government looks at this periodically, decreases the tariff, and that's in an attempt to keep that 15 to 18% rate of return that I mentioned, keep it reasonable, because you can't have it going to 150% like it would have, right? So they keep ratcheting it down, and they have done a masterful job of it. The incredible thing is that you look at Q4 2011, it was about 22 cents, euro cents a kilowatt hour. That is less than the retail rate in Germany, okay? So Germany, which has about the worst solar resource you could imagine, similar to Seattle, now PV going in there, no incentives, okay, just this retail feed-in tariff, you get paid less than the retail rate, okay? It's essentially not costing the German people anything now to put in more. They're actually saving money. And why would somebody still do it if it's less than the retail rate? Simply because the rate of return. The PV generator is so cheap, okay? It's great. That's the retail rate. Other people are looking at this. This is some stuff from Q cells. This is a plot that shows the what's called the retail break-even or grid parity point. And it's on a scale of where electricity price, local electricity price is on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is the solar resource. Obviously, those regions with the highest electricity price and the highest solar resource are the most economical. But the important point here is that already that hatched region where it makes sense to put in PV encompasses Spain, it encompasses Italy, it's halfway through Germany. That's the blob, the big orange blob down there on the right. So we see what this was in 2010. What's happening is that line where there's that retail parity break even is just moving more and more, encompassing more and more of Europe as we go forward. So let's finish up with a little bit with the roadmaps that the industry has had. We always had plotted this on a learning curve basis, log of accumulated production versus log of module price, and it tends to come out to be a straight line. And that is not unique to PV. It's a very common feature of manufactured goods, so it can be used as a forecasting tool. This is actually a learning curve that we put together when we sold Sunpower to CITRIS Semiconductor in 2002. And you can see we posited that based on the learning curve that the module price would be $1.74 per watt by 2013. You won't see economists do this very much, but what I show here is what actually happened compared to what we promised 10 years ago. That's the little red dots there. And we actually, the pricing went up for a while. This was caused by a shortage in silicon raw material, but it was a scary moment because we as an industry had sold the regulators on the fact that if you keep supporting this industry, we'll get the cost down to where you don't need to support us. And there were a number of years there where the cost was going up. It was a little bit of a dicey time, but since then the cost has come down dramatically. So we could say, well, we've done pretty good with the old roadmaps. What about the new roadmaps? It turns out the next 5 years or so are going to be fairly lean within the industry. We're projecting a lot of people are projecting, this is one from Piper Jaffray, but that the industry will go from a annual growth rate of that's been over 50% to something like 20% for the next 5 years. I think from the point of view of the research community, this is good news, because there's excess capacity right now, and when that excess capacity is finally used up in 3 or 4 years, or 3 years, say, people will be building new factories. They won't be building the generic old type systems. They won't call up Centrotherm and say, build me a standard line to make standard solar cells. It will be time for something new to come along, and that's where the research community can really contribute, getting that something new ready for prime time in the next 5 years or so. But in any case, if we expand in on that learning curve, we see that module prices have continued to come down dramatically. You can see that the $1.25 a watt last year in 2011 is well below the historic learning curve projections. This year, it looks like we're going to go to about a little bit under $1 a watt in 2012. And that compares, for example, with what other people were saying. The little triangles there are from a company called iSupply that studies this sector, among others. And they were saying that in 2012, they thought the module price would be 90 cents a watt, 99 cents a watt. Most of us, when they came out with that in mid-2011, said they can't be right. That can't be right. Well, it looks like they are right. And they see those prices continuing to come down. So the idea that we would hit grid parity based on the old learning curve is history now. We're actually going to go much faster than the old learning curve, and PV is going to become cost-effective through wide ranges of the globe much sooner than people thought. The little X there on the lower right at 50 cents a watt, that's the Sunshot goal, the new DOE program, which is, you can see that the purpose of the Sunshot program is to create a breakthrough technology that will dramatically change the make PV cheap as coal in most places in the world, but it would require a breakthrough. You can see that it definitely requires a breakthrough because it is so far from the projected learning curve that it's hard to imagine how you could get there without a breakthrough. And I think the kind of things that are going on within the university communities and the research communities are extremely exciting, and I expect will result in that kind of breakthrough. So let me just finish up here with how Sunpower looks at the. I actually don't have time to do that. Anyway, this is politically a little bit dicey, and in this election year, I don't want to go there. So let me just say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
So maybe we have the 1 or 2 short questions.
With respect to the grid parity chart you showed, Europe showed Portugal, Spain, half Germany in there. Does that include any kind of fixed standby charges?
No.
No,
it doesn't. So these are some of the skeletons in the closet. It's just comparing what a customer pays for buying from the utility versus what he could generate himself for. It doesn't reimburse the utility for stranded costs that they have and requirements they have to supply you when the sun is not shining. I think that's sort of one of the next stages in how the regulatory framework will have to evolve. The utilities are going to have to become much more intimate with this now as we move beyond 1 or 2% penetration into their system to 20 to 30% or even 40%, where a lot of us think it'll go. That's going to dramatically change things for how utilities are operated with all that intermittent resource on there, and how they get compensated for the cost to continue that will be an ongoing dialogue.
Hi, can you comment on the policy uncertainty on the business cycle in the PV market? As you mentioned that Germany revised the feed-in tariff periodically, whereas in California, there is a transparent thing on the internet, you can actually see the cumulative capacity, and then you can expect what will be the rebates going to be next month. So how this affect the business of the solar companies like Sunpower?
Well, you know, I think for better or for worse, we live in a very policy-driven environment, and energy has always been very political. I found this out with great disgust after I'd already committed to entering this field. But we as a country, for example, built the Rural Electrification Act and electrified all the farms at vast cost because we made the political decision that that was an important thing to do. So what I see is going on in the policy front right now is the Germans really carried the ball for a long time, showed the way. There were a lot of problems with their approach. There were problems with the older approaches, for example, in California. And now everybody's seeing what works, what doesn't work, and they're merging these approaches together, taking the best practices. It sort of reminds me of programming languages when, in the early days, every time a language came up with a neat idea on how to simplify using it, all the other languages adopted it. So today, you don't even need programming languages. Well, that I think is happening worldwide, that the community is learning from each other, communicating with each other, and rationalizing the incentive programs. Fortunately, it's getting easier and easier to do because the amount of incentives per kilowatt hour that's needed is rapidly coming down.
All right. Any other comments or questions? If not, let's send our speaker.